My name is Scott Nanian, and I'm here with Deborah Brown. We're going to talk about town meeting. So I calling this for the time being, we're calling this Town Meeting Talk. The idea of the show is to empower you to make change in our town by demystifying our form of town government, talking about it a little bit, and hopefully helping you make a difference. So this episode is going to be about the process of passing a law in our town and teach you how to do it. So we'll get to that in a second. First, we'll introduce ourselves again. I'm Scott Nanian. I've been a town meeting member for a while now for Precinct 10, which is the Coolidge Corner, Washington Square area. And I'm running for town moderator. I've brought 18 or so amendments or motions through the town meeting process. I've learned a bunch of lessons, some of them the hard way, and we'll talk about that, I guess. And Deborah, why don't you introduce yourself?
All right. My name is Deborah Brown. I am a town meeting member in Precinct 1. I have brought a few warrant articles successfully myself. And, I may also have a few tricks of the trade. But, the most important thing is that you understand that this is a process that anybody can avail themselves of. So.
Yeah, we all our lessons we've learned the hard way, right? By trying it and doing it wrong, and hopefully we're going to make it a little easier for you to try, and maybe you'll do a few less things wrong than we did. But the whole point is to get out there and do it. So I've long been an admirer of Deborah's work in town meeting. I'm thrilled to have a chance to do this little show with her. I think, Deborah, you and I started working on town meeting articles when we ran into each other at a school committee meeting. I'll say as an aside, one great way to find out how things work in town is just to start showing up at meetings. You always learn something new about something you didn't really intend to be there for. I forget entirely what I was there for, probably something regarding to the Driscoll School. I don't know what you were there for, but we both learned something about Metco buses, I think. Do you remember that, Deborah?
Oh, I remember. I think we were there to discuss the school committee and the town had gotten a grant from the state for an electric vehicle project. And I said, so we're going to put up stations throughout Brookline. But what about kids who are riding on diesel-fueled buses and the health consequences of that? And why aren't we doing the same for the Metco buses? And then we got into this whole conversation about how we make decisions in the town.
Yeah, and about the gap sometimes between green issues and equity, and that the issue of the Metco buses seemed like a really great opportunity. Still, because we haven't succeeded yet, but an opportunity for us to combine climate change issues and reduction of pollution with equity issues and reducing pollution in places in town where it's needed, not just reducing, making green areas of town a little bit greener. What I'm hoping to talk about in this episode is how your ideas as a resident of the town become law. So the great thing about Brookline's town meeting is it's originally a direct democracy. So everyone learns about the three branches of government: the executive, the judicial, the legislative. Well, the legislative branch in Brookline originally was everyone, all the residents in Brookline, right? So everyone who lived in Brookline was in theory a lawmaker for the town. Now, it didn't actually work out that way in practice. It wasn't actually everyone who lived in Brookline, and for for over 2/3 of the town's history, since town meeting was founded in 1705, less than half of the people who lived in Brookline could actually participate. But that's the dream. That's what we're trying to get closer to, and still. Any resident of Brookline has a lot of power through town meeting to have an effect on what laws there are in our town and what we do. So the idea here is like that episode of Schoolhouse Rock. So this is how a bill becomes a law. This is how your idea as a town meeting member would become a law in our town. One of the first things to know is, so town meeting is the legislative branch. And originally everyone in town came to town meeting. That was the town the town part of town meeting. But at some point, town meeting got too big. Deborah, you want to describe how town meeting works now?
Yeah, it's 260-ish people by the time you get through all of the town meeting members. There are other elected officials who were there. But really, to me, the process begins when you have an idea, and really taking the time to sit down and ask yourself, is this something that's best suited for a warrant article of the town meeting process, or is it something that could be addressed administratively by going directly to the town and asking them or recommending to them a certain policy or financial modification? If you're convinced that using the legislative route is the best process, the first step is, sitting down and deciding, what is it you want? And do you want it to be a bylaw, which has the weight of law? Do you want it to be a resolution, which is more of a suggestion? Are you looking for a budget amendment that says, I really want to question not just the way that you're spending money, but I actually have an idea that may be a more appropriate use of money. So you've created the bylaw. You've created your proposed warrant article, and next you're going to end up in a very weird way going through a review, and I would call it shopping your warrant article.
Yeah, so I'm going to back up for a second. We'll talk about, so the thing that I, when I help folks with ideas for town meeting, that first step that you said, what kind of warrant article, what kind of thing do you want to do is the part which folks need the most help with getting started, right? They've got this idea. It would be great if we had, if this park were handicapped accessible or had a curb cut. Or it would be great if we could somehow fund mutual aid Brookline. Or it would be great if we could, if we knew where our COVID funds were being spent. There's some of the articles from or ideas that have come up recently. And so this is where I'm hoping that if I'm elected moderator is one area where we can help guide. And certainly, I think you and I have helped a lot of people sort of navigate that process to say, hey, what you need to talk to is this person in town staff. They can tell you, if we've already got funding for this, or that sounds like we have a DPW hearing just before town meeting where the head of the Department of Public Works comes and they talk about some of their public works projects in town and are really listening for citizen suggestions on curb cuts, or this tree is too big, or it would be great if this intersection were retimed. And that's the great venue for that. So hopefully all of us as town meeting members and you, I think you and I in particular are very eager to help people who have good ideas figure out how to navigate the town. But then when it comes down to actual warrant articles for the things which are going to come before town meeting, you mentioned there's basically three types, right? There's a resolution, which is non-binding, and we'll talk about that a little bit. There's a bylaw change, which is one of our town's bylaws. So plastic bag bans were a bylaw change. And there's a zoning bylaw change, which is which has to do with how our town is zoned and what you can build where. So you and I think have done examples of all of these. You want to pick a favorite warrant article that you've done and the type, and explain why you chose that type of, or why that type of warrant article was appropriate?
It's funny because the first two that come to mind, one is the school renaming, which was a resolution. But then there's the community engagement warrant article, which was actually a bylaw. And I think that maybe I'll discuss the bylaw. But the bylaw basically was born out of the fact that there was nothing in our town regulations that specifically said that town employees should figure out a way to robustly, transparently communicate with residents throughout the year. And so that was the genesis or the beginning of the idea. How do we disseminate information in Brookline, and who is responsible for it? And there was no one. And so we had the idea. Then what we did is we looked at some of the existing laws around diversity, inclusion, economic development, which had a little bit of inclusion language or community engagement language, but not enough for it to be meaningful. And so we agreed that what we would do is draft a budget amendment, and that budget amendment was actually the warrant article was actually an amendment to an existing bylaw.
Right.
And I'm not going to get in the weeds there as to why we took that tact. But go ahead. Sorry, Scott.
No, I'll agree. So I'll say, so what, how this usually comes to me when someone has an idea is they'll mention something like, affordable housing or something. And I'll point them to the section in the town bylaws that deals with that. Right. So the simplest version of a bylaw amendment, for example, is the one that we did recently that adjusted the membership of the Housing Advisory Board. Right, that said the folks who make decisions about affordable housing should include representatives from affordable housing. Right. And not just one, but like meaningful representation. So that's a fairly easy change. You look up in our bylaws where it says Housing Advisory Board, and you sort of say, well, where it says one here, that really should be two, or three, or whatever the case may be. And the examples you have, like the Racial Equity Advancement Fund, were bylaws. The Commission on Women was a bylaw. So if you say there should be a commission in town which considers the needs of senior citizens or considers the needs of women in our town, those were bylaw changes which set up those committees in town. It's not the only way to set up a committee in town, but it's one of the ways. Diversity, the Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations Commission, the CDICR, was a bylaw which also set up a townwide department, I believe, right? So that was rather complicated. Mm-hmm. Plastic bag bans were a bylaw. Things. So we're having this debate in town about whether the clerk should be appointed or elected. That turns out to be a bylaw change as well. What about resolutions? Where have you done some resolutions that have been? Resolutions are a little odd in town because folks, when they come to me and I say, I know as soon as I say, well, this sounds like it should be a resolution, the first thing they want to say is, no, but I want it to be binding. I don't want this like non-binding business, right? So maybe the question for you is, what are some resolutions that actually had meaningful effects in town?
For me, the biggest one was renaming the Edward Devotion School the Florida Ruffin Ridley School.
Right. So that actually illustrates a good point too, which is sometimes why they are resolutions is because town meeting doesn't actually have the authority on its own to do this. In that case, naming of school buildings is something only the school committee can do. Town meeting can't, but town meeting can propose a resolution, and the other various boards and committees in town take the advice of town meeting expressed in resolutions very seriously, as they did in this case. So that is a really good example of where the way to make an actual effective change in town, renaming the school, had to be done via a resolution for sort of technical reasons, not because anyone thought that the recommendation in town meeting was not going to have effect.
But it's funny because for that one, I even think that the word resolved had significance for a lot of the residents because it was stronger because it was a warrant article that actually began, months before it got to the floor of town meeting. And so the work for the warrant article, began months in advance. So by the time we got to the resolution, there was a lot of support. And so that resolve had weight.
I'll say that the Driscoll School project also began as a resolution. It was a resolution attached to a budget item, as the case may be. That was the initial statement from town meeting that said, yes, we think this project should go forward. And it took a while before it got to the point where it was an actual binding authorization to issue a bond or to do a debt exclusion vote eventually. So there's a lot of technical stuff which happened first, but the very first step was the resolution that said town meeting agrees this is a project we want to do. And I find like that's fairly common. We have got a climate emergency resolution coming before town meeting as well, where an actual budget amendment, when you file it, has to be dollars and cents. It has to be, you can't just sort of say, we think the town should fund this. You have to say, we think the town should appropriate exactly this much money for this particular purpose. And the budget has to be balanced. So sometimes it also has to say where the money is coming from, right? And you and I have done that as well. But if the first step there is sometimes also a resolution, we resolve as a town that the town should establish sustainability goals for the town, right? And those might boil down into specific budget imperatives later, but the first step is to build consensus around that this is a project we want to do. I think the Racial Equity Advancement Fund was a bylaw change to establish the fund before it got to a specific allocation of funds. Have you done a zoning?
I think. Oh, excuse me. And I think that the budget amendment process is really one of those areas where moderator can play an incredibly important role because it really is one of those. I mean, it's one of those areas where you have to know the lay of the land, and not just in terms of being the neutral, but you have to have some experience with the town budget process. I mean, you've had experience with that.
Yeah, some of those lessons were learned the hard way as well, but we've gotten through there. I think one of the moderators' few actual hard power responsibilities is naming the advisory committee, which delivers the first draft of the town's budget. So that's the mechanism by which the town's priorities are first expressed. And again, that can be amended by town meeting members. And the sort of zeroth draft comes from town staff, but the advisory committee has a big role to play in figuring out how to balance the priorities of the town with fiscal realities. I was going to ask if you've done a zoning bylaw change.
I have not.
Yeah,
I have not.
That was one of my I don't know, proudest moments. I got a warrant article passed unanimously through a town meeting, which doesn't happen very often because there's always one or two people who are going to cast a no vote on something. But that was one of my EV related zoning articles. So if you care about what types of housing are built where, or the recent fossil fuel free amendments, making sure that parking spaces have provisions for electric vehicles. Those are all types of things which fall in the zoning bylaw. And it's a little harder to get a zoning bylaw change passed because it requires a 2/3 majority, although that's recently been reduced. But for the EVs, that was another case where it was a resolution first and then became a zoning bylaw later. Don't knock resolutions is I guess what I'm saying, right? They lay the groundwork, and that's important in a lot of cases. Okay, so
excuse me. And sometimes a resolution may be a really good way of just waking up town meeting that there's something really important that you may not even believe it's going to pass, but it is the best way to get a robust discussion going about a particular policy or program.
Yeah. I mean, it guarantees town meeting in general guarantees a robust discussion in town about the article that you filed. Okay, so we've made it. We've almost made it to step 0 of we're like 2/3 of our way through our time, and we've made it to the idea. You've got your idea. You've had a conversation with the moderator or trusted town meeting members, and they've told you this sounds like a resolution, or this sounds like a bylaw change, or this sounds like a zoning bylaw change, or this sounds like a conversation you need to have with town staff. So what comes next? So yes, when you draft it, there are a few magic words you have to use, for resolutions and everything has to see if the town will discuss, and then the text of your thing, and then or anything related to there too. And we can talk about those magic words in the future sometime. But the basic process after that, you gather signatures, only 10, but have to be registered voters in town. It's not a huge burden. And there are people who, like you and I, who will help you, who know town meeting members. I know 10 town meeting members in my precinct easy who can help you get signatures. You turn it in, you file an electronic copy as well, which helps keep the town from having to retype it. And then it gets scheduled for a series of hearings. And this is where, as you said, the real sort of work gets done. By the time the article is actually debated in town meeting, to some degree, the lines are drawn, and we've sort of boiled the issue down to, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 options. And that's where we'll pick it up next week, the hearing process. What goes on between filing your article and the debate at town meeting. We'll talk about the select board, the advisory committee, and the debate at town meeting. I'm Scott Nanian, and you're
Deborah Brown. See you next time.
See you next time.